There is a mansion on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, that exists in two versions. The first version appears in architectural histories and preservation guides. Clarendon Court, they explain, represents one of the finest examples of Georgian Revival architecture in America, a 21-room palace built in 1904 from designs that originated in 1717. The smooth sandstone facade, the urn-embellished balustrade, the gilded iron gates opening onto a cobblestone courtyard, all of it preserved with exceptional fidelity across more than a century. The second version appears in true crime documentaries and legal textbooks. This is the mansion where Martha Sharp Crawford von Bülow was found unconscious on a bathroom floor on the morning of December 22, 1980. She would remain in a persistent vegetative state for 27 years and 11 months, never waking, while her husband stood trial twice for attempted murder. The case captivated a nation. Jeremy Irons won an Academy Award for playing the husband accused of injecting his heiress wife with insulin and to claim her $75 million fortune. Both versions are true, but neither tells the complete story. Before the von Bülows arrived in 1970, before Hollywood filmed at the mansion's gates in 1956, before the first owner died under circumstances that would echo through the decades, Clarendon Court was already collecting the kind of history that most buildings never witness. The mansion, built from a design that had never been realized, would watch as fortune after fortune collapsed within its walls, as marriages ended in death or divorce, as each new owner discovered that beauty of this magnitude demands a price few can sustain. Before we begin this remarkable story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by stories where wealth, architecture, and tragedy intersect in ways stranger than fiction, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss where we're headed next. To understand how a building becomes synonymous with misfortune, we must begin not in 1980, but in the summer of 1904, when Newport stood at the apex of American wealth, and one man decided to build a monument to ambitions he could not afford. Chapter 1. The Summer Colony's Last Monument. In the summer of 1904, Newport, Rhode Island, functioned as the undisputed capital of American excess. Along Ocean Drive and Bellevue Avenue, the wealthiest families in the nation had constructed what they carefully called summer cottages. The term hardly captured the reality. The breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, contained 70 rooms spread across 125,000 square feet. Marble House, commissioned by Alva Vanderbilt, featured a ballroom modeled after the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Rosecliff recreated the Grand Trianon. These were not homes. They were declarations of financial supremacy rendered in limestone, marble, and gilt. The competition had reached proportions that strained even Gilded Age fortunes. Each mansion required not merely construction, but perpetual feeding. Staff numbered in the dozens. Annual operating costs exceeded what most American families earned in a lifetime. Property taxes alone could bankrupt the unprepared. The mansions demanded constant attention, constant money, constant vigilance against the salt air that corroded everything it touched. By 1904, the summer colony had peaked. The families who had defined Newport's golden age were beginning to understand that maintaining these monuments would prove more difficult than building them. Some estates had already changed hands. Others stood partially occupied, their owners unable to sustain the scale they had created during more optimistic years. Into this landscape of competitive grandeur came Edward Collings Knight, Jr. Knight was 41 years old, the son of a Philadelphia sugar refiner who had invested wisely in railroads and invented the sleeping car that George Pullman had purchased and made famous. When his father died in 1892, Edward inherited control of mining interests and railroad directorships that generated substantial income. He had money, more money than most Americans could imagine. The business acumen that had generated that wealth, however, remained with his father's generation. Edward Jr. had inherited fortune without the instinct to preserve it. In 1901, Knight purchased 1 acre of land on Bellevue Avenue for $40,000, equivalent to roughly $1.4 million today. He bought the parcel from William Collins Whitney, one of the era's most prominent financiers. The property occupied a strategic position where Ochre Point Avenue, met the Atlantic Ocean. To the south stood the estate called Reef Point, owned by the Isnaga family. Mrs. Isnaga was elderly and in declining health. Knight understood that when she died, he might acquire that property as well, expanding his foothold on Newport's most prestigious avenue and creating an estate that could rival the great cottages that already dominated the landscape. Knight intended to build something that would establish his family among the aristocracy that had defined American society for the previous half-century. He wanted a palace that would announce his arrival, a structure so perfect in its proportions and so refined in its execution that no one could question his right to stand among the Vanderbilts and Astors who had made Newport their summer kingdom. He hired architects, reviewed plans, and committed to a vision of grandeur that would ultimately cost him everything he had inherited. He arrived precisely at the wrong moment. The summer colony's golden age was ending just as Knight decided to join it. The families who had built the great cottages were discovering that the expense of maintaining them exceeded even their vast resources. The era of unlimited spending was giving way to an age of financial calculation. Several estates had already changed hands. Others stood partially occupied, their owners unable to sustain the scale they had created. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to see them. Knight either did not notice these signals or chose to ignore them. He proceeded with construction, convinced that his fortune would prove more durable than the empires that were already beginning to crumble around him. To understand why requires understanding where his money came from and what kind of man spent it. Chapter 2. The Sugar Fortune. Edward Collings Knight, Jr. had been born on a foundation he did not build. His father, Edward Collings Knight, Sr., had been born on December 8, 1813, on a farm in Collingswood, New Jersey. The family was Quaker stock, descended from Giles Knight, who had arrived in America with William Penn in 1682. When Edward Sr. was 10 years old, his father died, leaving 5 children and a widow with limited resources. The family moved in with the maternal grandfather. At 15, Edward Sr. commenced work as a grocery clerk in Philadelphia, spending 8 years learning the wholesale trade before establishing his own business. He worked 6 days a week, saving every penny, learning the business from men who had built their own fortunes through discipline and calculated risk. In 1836, Edward Sr. partnered with his mother in a wholesale and retail grocery operation in Philadelphia. The business prospered. When she withdrew from active management, he formed E.C. Knight and Company with a former clerk named Charles A. Sparks. The firm became sole agents for a large Philadelphia sugar refining operation called Kusenberg and Bartle. Edward Sr. proved exceptional at identifying opportunities. In 1861, he joined Kusenberg and Bartle directly, establishing the Southwark Sugar Refinery on the Delaware River waterfront. Within 2 decades, the refinery was producing 1,500 barrels daily, making it one of the largest sugar operations on the East Coast. Edward Sr. had also established shipping operations to Cuba and the West Indies for raw sugar, and to Chile and California for general groceries. The ships returned laden with cargo that filled his warehouses and fed his growing empire. But Edward Sr.'s ambitions extended beyond sugar. In 1859, he invented a railroad sleeping car that would revolutionize long-distance travel. He sold the patent to George Pullman, and the cars that made Pullman famous and wealthy were based on Edward Knight's original design. The sale brought Knight substantial capital, which he invested in railroad stocks and directorships. He served as president of the North Pennsylvania Railroad beginning in 1887. He held directorships at the Pennsylvania Railroad and at several banks. He helped develop coal properties in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, and the Camden Woolen Mills in New Jersey. He was nominated for Congress in 1856, but was defeated. He served as a Republican presidential elector in 1860 and sat in the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention in 1873. Every venture he touched seemed to multiply his wealth. When Edward Sr. died on July 21, 1892, he left an empire that generated income from sugar, railroads, mining, manufacturing, and shipping. His son, Edward Jr., was 29 years old. Edward Jr. had married Clara Waterman Dwight on June 30, 1886. They had one daughter, Clara Waterman Knight, born in 1887. Edward Jr. succeeded his father as president of the Delaware and Bound Brook Railroad Company and the Northern Pennsylvania Railroad Company. He held the titles. He attended the board meetings. He signed the documents that crossed his desk. His father's talent for generating wealth, however, had not passed to the son. People who knew Edward Jr. described him as an amateur artist who exhibited more talent at spending money than making it. He preferred aesthetic pursuits to business strategy. He collected paintings. He traveled to Europe, purchasing antiques and furniture that he shipped back to Philadelphia. He involved himself in artistic circles rather than the business networks that had made his father successful. The assessment was accurate. The empire his father had built through ruthless business sense and constant innovation would, under Edward Jr.'s management, begin a slow decline that would accelerate with each passing year. But in 1901, the money still flowed. The refineries still produced. The railroads still paid dividends. Edward Jr. turned his attention to Newport, where he believed a mansion could establish what inheritance had not yet delivered. Recognition among America's elite as a man of taste, refinement, and breeding. He would build something extraordinary. The cost never entered his calculations. Chapter 3. A House. From a Book. In 1903, Knight commissioned Horace Trumbauer to build him a monument that would last generations. Trumbauer was 35 years old, a Philadelphia architect who had achieved prominence despite having no formal training. He had been born on December 28, 1868, the son of a salesman. He dropped out of school at 14 and began working as an office boy at the architectural firm of G.W. and W.D. Hewitt. For 6 years he learned by watching, by copying drawings, by absorbing techniques from the established architects around him. He studied their plans. He attended construction sites. He taught himself the classical orders through books and observation. At 21, he opened his own practice with little more than confidence and an exceptional eye for proportion. When Knight approached him, Trumbauer had built a reputation for designing mansions for wealthy clients who wanted something that looked expensive and permanent. He understood scale. He understood materials. He understood how to translate a client's desire for social recognition into architectural form that would be photographed, published, and admired. Structural engineering and the finer points of classical orders, however, remained beyond his expertise. For that technical work, he hired assistants who understood mathematics and physics. In 1906, he would hire Julian Abel, the first African-American graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's architecture program. Abele would become chief designer, doing the complex calculations and detailed drawings, while Trumbauer took the credit and managed the wealthy clients. But in 1903, Abele had not yet arrived. Trumbauer was working through the challenge Knight had presented, searching for a design that would satisfy a client who wanted something unmistakably English, unmistakably aristocratic, and unmistakably expensive. Knight wanted something English, something that would evoke the country houses of the aristocracy he hoped to join through architectural association. Trumbauer searched for inspiration. He consulted books. He reviewed engravings. He studied the great houses that English architects had built in previous centuries, and then he found it in a book. Vitruvius Britannicus, published in 3 volumes between 1715 and 1725, was a catalogue of British architecture compiled by a Scottish architect named Colen Campbell. Campbell had been one of the leading proponents of Palladian architecture in England, advocating for a return to classical principles and proportions. The volumes contained hundreds of engravings of executed buildings and proposed designs, all rendered with extraordinary precision. Every column, every window, every cornice was drawn to scale and documented with measurements. Volume 2, published in 1717, included a design for a country house called Hedworth House, commissioned by John Hedworth, a member of Parliament, for a site at Chesterless Street in County Durham, England. The design was extraordinary. 2 stories rising from a rectangular plan with 1-story wings extending symmetrically on either side of the central block. A central entrance through a rusticated arch, windows arranged in perfect classical rhythm, their proportions calculated according to Palladian ratios. A flat roof topped with an urn-embellished balustrade that gave the composition a crown-like dignity. The design combined Palladian principles with English country house practicality. It was elegant, imposing, and eminently suitable for a wealthy American who wanted to suggest generations of breeding, he did not possess. Hedworth House had never been built. Campbell had drawn the design, published the engravings in 1717, and the project had gone no further. Perhaps Hedworth had run out of money. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps he had died before construction could begin. The reasons remained unknown. For 187 years, the design had existed only on paper, a phantom house that had never cast a shadow or sheltered a family. Trumbauer decided to change that. He would build Colen Campbell's phantom house in Newport, Rhode Island, bringing to life a vision that had remained unrealized for nearly 2 centuries. He made minimal modifications to the original design. The original featured cupolas over the wings on either side of the central block. Trumbauer removed them, preferring a cleaner roofline. Otherwise, he reproduced Campbell's vision with exceptional fidelity. The materials would be smooth sandstone rather than the brick or stone Campbell might have used in England. The scale would be adjusted slightly to accommodate American expectations and the specific requirements of Knight's site, but the essential design, the proportions, the classical rhythm of the facade, all of it would translate directly from the 1717 engravings to a 1904 construction site overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Construction began in the spring of 1903. Workers excavated the foundation on Knight's 1-acre parcel, removing tons of earth to create a level platform. The steel framework rose through the summer, a modern skeleton that would be concealed behind classical facades. As autumn arrived, the sandstone facade had begun to take shape, each stone cut and fitted according to Trumbauer's specifications. 21 rooms would fill the structure across 12,000 square feet of living space. A 10,200 square foot carriage house would occupy the rear of the property, providing space for vehicles, equipment, and staff quarters. High stone walls would surround the estate, creating privacy and enclosure. Gilded iron gates, wrought with exceptional care by craftsmen who understood that wealthy clients noticed details, would open onto a cobblestone courtyard that led to the main entrance. The work continued through 1904. Craftsmen installed the mahogany doors. Marble cutters laid the foyer floors. Plasterers created ornamental ceilings. In June, the mansion was complete. Knight named it Clarendon Court, honoring his wife Clara with a distinctive spelling that would appear on the estate's formal documentation and correspondence. The sentiment was conventional. The execution was extraordinary. He had built from a design that existed only in books, bringing to life a vision that its original creator had abandoned nearly 2 centuries earlier. Knight had chosen to build a house that existed only in drawings, a design that its original patron had abandoned before construction began. What Trumbauer created from those 187-year-old engravings would become one of Newport's most perfectly preserved facades, admired by architectural historians for its fidelity to classical principles, and studied as an example of how American wealth attempted to purchase European pedigree through stone and mortar. Chapter 4. 21 Rooms and an English Dream. 21 rooms filled the structure that rose on Bellevue Avenue, arranged across a footprint that covered 12,000 square feet. The original property line ran at the edge of what would later become the swimming pool. Everything beyond that point belonged to the Isnagai estate, until Mrs. Isnaga's death in 1908 allowed Knight to expand his holdings, eventually doubling the size of his property. But in 1904, Clarendon Court occupied just 1 acre, making it among the smaller estates on a street known for excess. The breakers covered more than 10 acres. Marble House commanded 8. Knight's single acre seemed modest by comparison, though the mansion itself was designed to maximize the impression of grandeur within its confined site. The structure compensated for limited acreage through architectural precision. The entrance presented a cobblestone courtyard enclosed by high stone walls that blocked views from the street. Gilded iron gates wrought with exceptional care and detailed with scrollwork that caught the afternoon light, opened to reveal the mansion's facade. The smooth sandstone glowed in changing light, its color shifting from cream to gold depending on the time of day and the season. The central block rose 2 full stories, its windows arranged in perfect classical rhythm that demonstrated Trumbauer's understanding of Palladian proportions, even if he lacked formal training. The 1-story wings extended symmetrically on either side, each terminating in a subtle projection that gave the composition balance without heaviness. The roof was flat, bordered by an urn-embellished balustrade that gave the structure the appearance of wearing a crown. Every element had been calculated to create the impression of permanence, breeding, and taste. Mahogany doors, carved with panels that caught light and shadow in deliberate patterns, opened onto a marble foyer that established the mansion's character. The entrance hall extended the full height of the two-story central section, creating a volume of space that impressed visitors immediately upon entry. A sweeping staircase curved upward to a landing where daylight filtered through arched windows. The marble floor, cut from Italian quarries and shipped across the Atlantic in carefully crated sections, reflected the light in subtle variations of cream and gray. The stone had been selected to complement the exterior sandstone, creating a coherent palette that ran from street to interior. The principal rooms occupied the ground floor, arranged according to conventions established by English country houses. Drawing rooms featured fireplaces that Trumbauer's team had sourced from 18th-century English country houses scheduled for demolition. The mantels, carved from limestone by craftsmen who had been dead for a century, supported paintings and mirrors that Clara Knight selected during trips to Europe. She had developed good taste through exposure rather than breeding, and she furnished the rooms with care. The walls were paneled in materials that suggested age and breeding. Oak that had been artificially aged to look like it had been installed during the 1700s. Plasterwork that mimicked Georgian originals. Arched French windows opened onto a loggia that ran the length of the southern facade, providing access to gardens that would be planted according to formal English designs drawn from pattern books Knight had purchased in London. The upper floor contained the family bedrooms and private spaces arranged along a central corridor. Edward and Clara each maintained separate chambers, connected by a shared sitting room where they could receive intimate guests or conduct family business away from the public rooms below. The separation of sleeping quarters was conventional among wealthy families, a matter of comfort and privacy rather than marital discord. The daughter, Clara Waterman Knight, occupied her own suite designed to accommodate the young woman's transition from childhood to society debut. Her rooms faced the ocean, providing views that the public rooms below could not achieve due to the grade of the property. The carriage house, constructed of brick and limestone to complement the main structure without competing with it, provided 10,200 square feet of space for vehicles, equipment, and staff quarters. This was not merely a garage. It was a complete support facility designed to keep the main house functioning. Grooms and drivers lived above the carriage bays in simple but adequate quarters. Storage rooms held supplies that would be needed throughout the year: coal for heating, wood for fires, equipment for maintaining the grounds. The scale suggested permanence, the kind of establishment that would serve multiple generations rather than a single owner's temporary residence. Trumbauer had succeeded in translating Campbell's vision across 2 centuries and an ocean. Whether the result would prove more durable than the original design, which had never progressed beyond engravings, remained to be seen. In June of 1904, the Knight family took possession of their English dream on American soil. They moved furniture from Philadelphia. They hired local staff. They prepared for their first summer season in Newport society. Edward Knight had achieved his goal. He had built a mansion that suggested generations of breeding and establishment. Whether he could afford to maintain it was another question entirely. Chapter 5. The Amateur Artist and the Inheritance. For 6 years, Edward and Clara Knight occupied the house that bore her name. Documentation of their daily life remains sparse, preserved only in fragments that appeared in society columns and estate records. Newport society columns mentioned their attendance at functions organized by families who had arrived before them. They hosted dinners for carefully selected guests. They appeared at charity events appropriate to their station and income level, but the intimate details of how they lived within Clarendon Court, what they discussed in those paneled drawing rooms, how they felt about the mansion Edward had commissioned to establish their position, these particulars went unrecorded or were lost when the family papers were dispersed after their deaths. The maintenance cost, however, can be documented through tax records and estate accounts. A mansion of this scale required constant feeding. Staff maintained the rooms, polishing the marble floors, dusting the paneling, keeping the brass fixtures bright. Servants prepared meals in kitchens that required coal-fired stoves. Gardeners tended the grounds, fighting against the salt air that killed delicate plants and turned green lawns brown by August. The property taxes alone exceeded what most American families earned annually, over $3,000 per year, equivalent to $90,000 in contemporary currency. The Knight fortune, built on sugar refining and railroad investments, was sufficient to support the expense in 1904. But the economic landscape was shifting in ways that Edward Jr. either did not notice or chose to ignore. The sugar market had begun to soften under pressure from cheaper production in South America and the Caribbean. New refineries in Cuba could undercut Philadelphia prices. The railroad investments that had sustained Edward Sr. were generating diminished returns under Edward Jr.'s management. Competition from other transportation companies was reducing profit margins. The Philadelphia sugar refinery that had made the family fortune was facing challenges it had never encountered during Edward Sr.'s leadership. Edward continued to hold his titles. He remained president of the Delaware and Bound Brook Railroad Company and the Northern Pennsylvania Railroad Company. He attended board meetings when they occurred. He signed documents that subordinates placed before him. Innovation, expansion, adaptation to changing markets. None of these activities defined his tenure the way they had characterized his father's career. The amateur artist in him preferred aesthetic pursuits to business strategy. He collected paintings. He attended gallery openings. He involved himself in artistic circles where his opinions about Impressionism and the new American painters were welcomed by people who cared more about his money than his judgment. The fortune began its slow decline, a process that would accelerate after his death. Clara Waterman Knight died in 1910. She was 48 years old. The cause of death went unspecified in available records, though family papers suggest it may have been cancer. She was buried in the family plot. And Edward Knight departed Clarendon Court for another Trumbauer-designed property in Middletown called Stony Brook. The mansion in Newport held too many memories. He would never return to live in the house he had named for his first wife, though he retained ownership and continued to pay the mounting costs of maintaining a property he no longer occupied. The estate passed to their daughter, Clara Waterman Knight, who was 23 years old when her mother died. She had married Sidney Jones Colford Jr. in 1907 when she was 20 years old. Colford was a prominent figure in Newport society, descended from families that had summered in Rhode Island since before the Civil War. According to the New York Times, the couple took up their residence in Newport immediately after their marriage, where they entertained extensively during the summer months. They had 2 daughters within the first years of their marriage. Clarendon Court, under the younger Clara's ownership, continued to function as a summer residence for the socially ambitious, hosting the same functions that her mother had organized before illness ended her tenure as hostess. The marriage ended in 1920. The divorce was not publicized extensively, but society columns noted that Clara Waterman Knight Colford had taken her 2 daughters and departed for the French Riviera, establishing residence in the expatriate community that flourished on the Mediterranean coast between the wars. In 1921, without announcement or formal engagement, she married Francis Hunter Potter, a well-connected American living in Nice, in a civil ceremony that surprised those who still tracked the movements of old Newport families. Newport society noted the irregularity. The remarriage raised eyebrows among families who still observed conventions about appropriate mourning periods and proper engagements. But Clara had distanced herself from those judgments by choosing Europe over Rhode Island, the French coast over Bellevue Avenue. Clara Waterman Knight Colford Potter died in 1924 in Nice. She was 37 years old. The cause was reported as sudden illness, though details never reached American newspapers. Her daughters inherited Clarendon Court and maintained the property for 5 years, visiting occasionally during summer months, but never occupying it as their mother had. They were young women by this point, establishing their own lives, and neither felt the connection to Newport that their grandmother had cultivated. The era of private summer palaces was ending. The Great War had changed everything. The expense of maintaining a 21-room mansion and its grounds, the property taxes that had increased every year, the staff costs that had risen as servants demanded higher wages, the constant repairs required by salt air and harsh winters that corroded metal and damaged stone, all of it had become unsustainable for a generation that had inherited wealth but not the empires that generated it. The daughters acknowledged what had become evident to many Newport families. In 1929, they sold the mansion to Harry S. Black, president of the George A. Fuller Company, one of the largest construction firms in America. Black paid a price that was never publicly disclosed, but was understood to be a fraction of the mansion's original construction cost. He held the property for barely a year before health problems forced him to sell. The estate changed hands again in 1930. The buyer who arrived that year carried a fortune built on railroads and pearls, and a history of marriages that would continue to accumulate. Chapter 6. Maisie and the Harlem Hellfighters Sarah May Caldwell had been married 3 times before she purchased Clarendon Court in 1930. Her friends called her Maisie, a nickname she had carried since childhood. She had been born in 1878 into comfortable circumstances in Washington, D.C., the daughter of a successful merchant. But the fortune that allowed her to acquire Newport real estate came from her second husband, not her family. In 1904, she had married Morton Plant, a railroad and steamship magnate who was Commodore of the New York Yacht Club and one of the wealthiest men in America. Plant had inherited millions from his father's shipping and railroad operations, and had multiplied that wealth through shrewd investments. He died in 1918, leaving Maisie an inheritance of $50 million, equivalent to roughly $850 million in today's economy. The fortune made her one of the wealthiest women in America. Maisie was famous for more than her money. In 1917, she had traded the Fifth Avenue mansion she shared with Plant to Pierre Camille Cartier in exchange for a pearl necklace valued at $1 million. The mansion, a magnificent Beaux-Arts structure located at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street, became Cartier's New York headquarters, and remains so today, one of the most valuable retail properties in Manhattan. The pearls, however, did not endure. Maisie lost the necklace. No record exists of exactly how or when they disappeared, whether they were stolen, lost, or sold during one of her financial reorganizations. The mansion endures as a monument to the trade. The pearls vanished into history. Her third husband was Colonel William Hayward, legendary commander of the 369th Infantry Regiment during World War I. The regiment, composed of African-American soldiers who had been denied the opportunity to serve in integrated units, earned the nickname Harlem Hellfighters for their combat performance in France, where they spent 191 days under fire, longer than any other American unit. Hayward, though white himself, had advocated for the regiment's formation and led them with distinction, earning their respect and the admiration of the French army that fought alongside them. He married Maisie in 1930, shortly before they purchased Clarendon Court as a summer retreat where they could entertain friends and display Maisie's growing art collection. They renamed it Clarendon Court, adopting a more traditional English spelling that appeared in the records when they filed the deed. Maisie set about transforming the interior to accommodate her art collection and her vision of what a Newport summer cottage should contain. She hired contractors to remodel the service wing, which had originally housed kitchen facilities and staff quarters, into a private art gallery. Under Maisie's direction, walls were removed and the space became a single large room with proper lighting and walls designed specifically to display paintings without damaging them. Temperature control systems were installed, an innovation for the time. The gallery became one of the mansion's most important features. The collection was extraordinary. Works by François Boucher, Jean-Antoine Watteau, George Romney, Thomas Gainsborough, Henry Rayburn, Rembrandt van Rijn, Thomas Lawrence, and Andrea del Sardo hung in the gallery and throughout the main rooms, arranged with curatorial precision. Many of these paintings would eventually enter the Frick collection in New York after Maisie's death, preserved for public viewing long after the mansion that once housed them had passed to other owners. She furnished Clarendon Court with Queen Anne and Georgian pieces that complemented the house's English character, chairs that had been crafted in London workshops during the 1700s, tables that bore the marks of master cabinet makers, cabinets designed to display the porcelain she had collected during trips to Europe. Chelsea, Meissen, Royal Doulton, and Dresden porcelain filled those cabinets and mantels, each piece selected for quality and provenance. The dining room table was set with silver cutlery from the period of George I, serving pieces that weighed pounds each and required constant polishing to maintain their brilliance. Maisie's son from her first marriage occasionally joined them at Newport during the summer months. Philip Morgan Mainwaring Plant had been adopted by Morton Plant and took his stepfather's surname, inheriting a portion of the Plant fortune that allowed him to live without working. It was for Philip that the term playboy was first coined, entering American vocabulary during his highly publicized divorce from actress Constance Campbell Bennett. The scandal was national news, covered breathlessly by newspapers that detailed every charge and countercharge. Philip embodied a new generation that treated wealth as entertainment rather than responsibility, spending money on yachts and parties and women rather than building the empires that had generated the family fortune. Colonel Hayward died in 1944. Maisie had lost her third husband. The pattern was established. She would marry once more, and Clarendon Court would witness one more era before Hollywood arrived at its gates. Chapter 7. High Society and the Financier. In 1954, at the age of 76, Maisie married for the fourth time. John Edward Rovensky was an immensely successful financier who had built a career managing other people's money with exceptional skill. He was vice chairman of the Chemical Bank and Trust Company, one of the largest financial institutions in New York. He had met Maisie while they were both playing poker at their mutual club in Palm Beach, where wealthy people gathered during the winter months to escape northern weather. He was 74 years old, a widower whose first marriage had produced one daughter. They discovered they shared interests in art, travel, and the kind of comfortable life that substantial wealth could provide. Maisie and Rovensky married in a quiet ceremony and returned to Clarendon Court for what would be their only summer together as husband and wife. Maisie died in 1956. She was 78 years old. The fortune she had inherited from Morton Plant, $50 million in 1918, had diminished to $4 million by the time of her death. The remainder had been spent on houses in multiple cities, art that filled galleries and storage facilities, jewelry that she wore to functions and parties, and the lifestyle that Newport demanded from anyone who wanted to maintain position in a society that was already fading. $4 million was still substantial wealth, but it represented only 8% of what she had inherited 38 years earlier. Rovensky inherited Clarendon Court and the remnants of Maisie's wealth, along with furniture, art, and personal effects that would take years to catalog and distribute. That same year, Rovensky allowed a Hollywood production company to film at the mansion's gates. High Society, a musical adaptation of the Philadelphia story, starred Grace Kelly in her final film role before she married Prince Rainier of Monaco and became Princess Grace. Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra rounded out the cast in a production that updated the original story to include musical numbers and Technicolor photography. The film's publicity suggested that Clarendon Court had served as a primary location, one of the Newport mansions where wealthy families gathered for weddings and scandal. This was inaccurate. Only the entrance gates and the wall along Bellevue Avenue appeared in the final film, providing establishing shots that suggested Newport luxury. All interior shots were filmed on MGM's backlot in California, where production designers had built elaborate sets that only approximated the real interiors of mansions, like Clarendon Court. Location filming technology had not yet perfected the ability to shoot inside actual mansions, and the production schedule did not allow for the complexity of working in a private residence where furniture and art would need to be protected. Nevertheless, the myth persisted that High Society had been filmed at Clarendon Court, adding Hollywood glamour to the mansion's history and attracting tourists who drove slowly past the gates, hoping to glimpse what Grace Kelly had seen. Rovensky continued to summer at Clarendon Court through the 1960s, maintaining the property and Maisie's art collection with care. In 1959, he donated $175,000 to the Preservation Society of Newport County for the purchase of land adjacent to several historic properties. The land became Rovensky Park, a public space where residents could walk and enjoy ocean views. The donation ostensibly honored Maisie's memory, though the park bore his name rather than hers, a detail that did not escape notice among Newport families who understood how credit was typically distributed. He died in 1970 at the age of 90, Having lived long enough to see Newport transform from a summer colony for the wealthy to a tourist destination where middle-class visitors paid admission to tour the mansions that families like Maisie's had once occupied, his daughter, Jane Ewing Rovensky, inherited the property and promptly listed it for sale. She lived in California and had no interest in maintaining a Newport summer cottage that required year-round staff and constant attention. The mansion sold quickly to buyers who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. When Jane Ewing Rovensky sold Clarendon Court in 1970, she could not have known she was handing the keys to a man who would make the mansion internationally infamous, transforming it from an architectural treasure into a setting for one of the most sensational criminal cases of the 20th century. The new owner had been born Claus Cecil Borberg in Copenhagen in 1926. Chapter 8. The Danish aristocrat and the American heiress Claus von Bülow had not been born with the von. His father, Sven Borberg, was a Danish playwright who wrote for the theater in Copenhagen, producing works that were occasionally performed but never achieved commercial success. During World War II, when Germany occupied Denmark, Sven Borberg was accused of collaborating with the Nazi occupation forces. The specific charges remained unclear, but they were serious enough that he was imprisoned after the war ended, and Denmark began prosecuting those who had aided the enemy. The charges were eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. But the stigma remained. Sven Borberg died in 1947. Disgraced and largely forgotten, his plays no longer performed. His son, born Claus Cecil Borberg in 1926, chose to distance himself from that name and everything it represented. He adopted his mother's surname, Jonna von Bülow-Pluskow, which suggested aristocratic German heritage. He added the von himself, claiming a noble pedigree that suggested breeding and European sophistication. The von indicated nobility in German-speaking countries, a particle that implied generations of distinguished service and inherited position. Whether Claus had legitimate claim to the aristocratic surname remained questionable, but no one challenged him. He studied law at Trinity College, Cambridge, earning a degree that qualified him for legal practice in Britain. His education was excellent, his manner refined. Rather than pursue a conventional legal career in London firms, he became personal assistant to J. Paul Getty, the oil magnate whose wealth exceeded most national budgets and who needed sophisticated advisors who could navigate European business and society. The position brought Claus into contact with the international elite who orbited around Getty's fortune: bankers, aristocrats, industrialists, and the wealthy women who attended the same parties and charity events. In 1966, at a social function in New York, he met Martha Sharp Crawford. Friends called her Sunny. She had been born on September 1, 1932. Though some records list 1931 and the discrepancy was never definitively resolved. What is certain is that she was born aboard her father's private railway carriage as the train traveled from Hot Springs, Virginia, to New York. The unusual birthplace earned her the childhood nickname Choo Choo before she transitioned to Sunny, a name that better suited the cheerful disposition she displayed as a young woman. Her father, George Crawford, had founded Columbia Gas and Electric Company, building a utilities empire that supplied gas and electricity to cities across the mid-Atlantic states. The business made him extraordinarily wealthy. He died on April 6, 1935, when Sunny was 3 or 4 years old, depending on which birth year was accurate. He left her an inheritance estimated between $75 and $100 million. Her mother, Annie Laurie Warmack, was 40 years younger than George Crawford, a young woman who had married an older man for reasons that society understood without discussing openly. After his death, she managed Sunny's inheritance with the help of professional advisors, ensuring the fortune grew rather than diminished. She eventually remarried, securing the family's financial legacy and social position. Sunny grew up between an apartment at 990 Fifth Avenue in New York and an estate called Tamerlane in Greenwich, Connecticut. Both properties were large, well-staffed, and filled with the kind of quiet luxury that very wealthy people cultivated. She attended the Chapin School in Manhattan, where daughters of prominent families received education appropriate to their station. She continued at St. Timothy's School outside Baltimore, an Episcopal boarding school that prepared young women for debuts and marriages to appropriate men. After graduating, she traveled to Europe with her mother, spending months visiting museums, attending concerts, and meeting the kind of people who moved in the same elevated circles. At a resort in Austria called Schloss Mittersill, a converted castle that catered to wealthy guests, she met Prince Alfred von Auersperg, a 20-year-old tennis professional with an aristocratic Austrian title and limited means. He was handsome, charming, and athletic. They married in July 1957 at Tamerlane in a ceremony covered by society pages across America. The marriage produced 2 children. Annie Laurie von Auersperg, called Alla, was born in 1958. Alexander von Auersperg followed in 1959. But Sunny and the prince discovered they had little in common beyond the initial physical attraction that had brought them together. He preferred sports and hunting, spending days pursuing game in the Austrian countryside. She preferred opera and reading, cultivating intellectual interests that bored him. The marriage dissolved in 1965 after 8 years, ending civilly without the kind of public scandal that sometimes accompanied divorces among the wealthy. When Sunny met Claus von Bülow in 1966, she was a 34-year-old divorcee with 2 young children and a fortune that required careful management. Claus was 40 years old, employed by one of the world's richest men, cultivated in his manner and European in his sensibility. He spoke multiple languages. He understood art and music. He moved comfortably in the world of wealth and privilege that Sunny inhabited. They married on June 6, 1966, at Brick Presbyterian Church in New York. Their daughter Cosima was born in April 1967, completing the family that would eventually occupy Clarendon Court. In 1970, the von Bülows purchased Clarendon Court from Jane Ewing Rovensky. Sunny's wealth made the acquisition effortless, requiring nothing more than instructions to her financial advisors. The price went unrecorded in available documents. But properties of this scale were selling for fractions of their construction cost as Newport families acknowledged they could no longer maintain the Gilded Age estates their grandparents had built. The von Bülows immediately commissioned extensive renovations to update systems and reconfigure spaces. They furnished the mansion with exceptional 18th and 19th century English furniture, purchased from dealers in London and New York. Sunny had exquisite taste, developed through years of visiting museums and studying period rooms. Visitors to Clarendon Court during the 1970s described the interior as a masterpiece of period decoration. Every room arranged with pieces that would not have been out of place in an English country house from the 1700s. The von Bülows also transformed the grounds in ways that previous owners had never attempted. They hired Innocenti and Webel, prominent landscape architects based in New York, to reconfigure the rear of the property and create views that would maximize the ocean setting. Bulldozers and front-end loaders spent months regrading the terrain, moving thousands of tons of earth. A 17-foot bluff that had blocked the ocean view from the ground floor rooms was removed entirely, opening sight lines that extended to the horizon. Trees were relocated or removed. An elegant allée was created, providing a clear, formal pathway from the mansion to the sea. The work cost a fortune and required permits from multiple authorities who regulated coastal properties and construction near the water. But when completed, Clarendon Court commanded its site with views that earlier owners had never enjoyed, transforming the mansion's relationship with its landscape. In 1974, Claus von Bülow wrote an article about Clarendon Court for the Bulletin of the Newport Historical Society. He described the mansion's architectural history, detailing its origins in Colen Campbell's Vitruvius Britannicus and its construction by Horace Trumbauer. He documented its various owners, from Edward Knight through Maisie Plant Hayward to John Rovensky. He ended the article with a personal reflection that would later seem haunting. The author of this article has lived happily at Clarendon for the past 4 years. As a European, he has found much to admire in Newport, with its sense of history and its preservation of a unique architectural heritage. The article appeared 6 years before Christmas of 1980. The happiness he described would not survive that long. The first sign that something was wrong came on the day after Christmas, 1979. Chapter 9. The First Christmas. On the morning of December 26, 1979, Sunny von Bülow did not wake up normally. The family had gathered at Clarendon Court for Christmas as they did every year. Sunny's children from her first marriage, Alla and Alexander von Auersperg, were visiting from their separate residences. Cosima, the daughter she shared with Claus, was 12 years old. They had celebrated the holiday together the previous day, opening presents in the drawing room, sharing meals prepared by the staff, maintaining the traditions that wealthy families observe even when underlying tensions strain the performance. The celebration had appeared normal to outside observers. Only those who knew the family well might have noticed the distance between Sunny and Claus, the way they occupied separate spaces, even when in the same room. December 26th began with concern. Sunny remained in her bedroom longer than usual. The staff noticed. When someone finally checked on her, she was lying in bed, unresponsive. Her breathing was shallow. Her skin was cold. The call went to Newport Hospital immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their ambulance navigating the narrow streets of the historic district. Sunny was transported to the emergency room, where doctors worked to stabilize her condition. She had slipped into a coma. The medical team ran extensive tests, blood work, neurological examinations, CT scans. After days of examination and consultation with specialists, they determined that Sunny's coma resulted from extremely low blood sugar. They diagnosed her as reactive hypoglycemic, a condition in which the body produces excessive insulin in response to sugar intake, causing blood sugar to drop to dangerous levels that can produce unconsciousness if severe enough. The doctors warned Sunny against overindulging on sweets or going too long without eating. They explained that maintaining stable blood sugar was critical for someone with her condition. They prescribed dietary modifications and recommended she carry glucose tablets in case she felt symptoms developing. Sunny recovered. She woke from the coma after several days, underwent additional testing to confirm the diagnosis, and returned to normal life. The incident was frightening, but the medical explanation seemed definitive. No one suspected foul play. The doctors had identified a metabolic condition, prescribed lifestyle modifications, and sent Sunny home with instructions to monitor her diet carefully and report any unusual symptoms. She followed the recommendations. She adjusted her eating patterns. Life continued. The year between the two comas passed. Sunny and Claus continued to divide their time between their Fifth Avenue apartment in New York and Clarendon Court in Newport, following the pattern that wealthy families had established over generations. The marriage had developed strains that friends noticed but did not discuss openly. Claus was conducting an affair with Alexandra Isles, a soap opera actress who had played Victoria Winters on the television series Dark Shadows. Their relationship was not particularly discreet. People in the same social circles were aware that Claus spent time with Isles when Sunny was occupied elsewhere. Whether Sunny knew about the affair remained unclear. If she did know, she never discussed it with friends or family members who might have documented the conversation. On the evening of December 21st, 1980, the family gathered again at Clarendon Court for Christmas. Sunny seemed agitated from the moment she arrived. Alexander, her son, noticed that she was slurring her words during dinner. She appeared incoherent at times, unable to follow conversations or respond appropriately to questions. Her movements were uncoordinated. Alexander suspected she had taken an overdose of sleeping pills, either accidentally or intentionally. He asked her repeatedly whether she had taken anything. She denied it each time, becoming increasingly upset by his questioning. The family attributed her condition to exhaustion from travel and the stress of holiday preparations. Claus helped her to bed around 9 in the evening, settling her in her room before retiring to his own separate chamber. In the morning, she was discovered unconscious on the bathroom floor. This time, she would never wake up. Chapter 10. The Bathroom Floor. The discovery was made by a member of the household staff on the morning of December 22, 1980. Maria Schrahlhammer, the family maid who had worked for the von Bülows for years, entered Sunny's bedroom to begin her morning duties. She found Sunny lying on the cold marble of her bathroom floor, unresponsive, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had collapsed suddenly. The call to Newport Hospital went out immediately. Paramedics transported her to the emergency room, where medical staff began emergency procedures. The medical team recognized immediately that this coma was different from the one she had experienced the previous year. Her vital signs suggested severe trauma. Her pupils were not responding normally to light. Her breathing was compromised. They stabilized her as best they could and arranged immediate transfer to a hospital in Boston, equipped to handle complex neurological emergencies. At the Boston facility, specialists conducted extensive testing over several days. Neurologists examined her. They performed brain scans. They monitored her vital signs constantly. The results confirmed the worst possible outcome. Sunny had suffered severe brain injury that had produced what medical professionals call a persistent vegetative state. Unlike the first coma, from which she had recovered fully after proper treatment, this condition was irreversible given current medical knowledge. She would not wake up. She would not regain consciousness. She would not recognize family or respond to stimuli. She would require life support indefinitely. Her brain function had diminished to the point where consciousness as humans understand it was no longer possible. Alla and Alexander von Auersperg suspected their stepfather immediately. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Exactly 1 year and 4 days after their mother's first coma, she had fallen into a second that proved permanent. They refused to accept that this was accidental or the result of Sunny's hypoglycemia. They believed Claus von Bülow had attempted to murder their mother, possibly twice. The von Auersperg children hired private investigators at a cost that would eventually exceed $400,000, about $1.4 million in current dollars. They hired Richard Koo, a prominent New York attorney who had served as district attorney of New York County, to coordinate the investigation. They were determined to prove what they suspected, regardless of cost. The investigators began their work at Clarendon Court. They interviewed staff members who had been present during both incidents. They examined Sunny's medical records from both hospitalizations. They searched the mansion systematically for evidence, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. The crucial discovery came when they entered Klaus's private study on the second floor. They wanted to examine a black bag that Klaus kept in his closet, a leather physician's bag that household staff had occasionally seen. The closet was locked. The investigators hired a locksmith and told him that one of them owned the house, a lie designed to avoid questions about the legality of the search. The locksmith drove to Clarendon Court prepared to pick the lock. When he arrived, he insisted they try once more to find a key before he began picking the mechanism. After some searching, Richard Koo found a key in Klaus's desk that opened the closet door. Inside the black bag, the investigators found a hypodermic needle. They carefully removed it without disturbing other contents. Testing at a laboratory revealed insulin residue on the needle. The discovery was devastating. Sunny's second coma had been caused by extremely low blood sugar, which could result from an insulin injection. A hypodermic needle with insulin traces hidden in Klaus's closet suggested that he had administered the injection that produced her irreversible condition. The evidence was circumstantial. No one had witnessed him giving the injection, but it was powerful. Additional evidence accumulated as the investigation continued. Maria Schrallhammer, the family maid, testified that Klaus had delayed calling for medical help when Sunny fell into her second coma. She described his behavior as suspicious, noting that he seemed unconcerned about Sunny's condition even as it became obvious she needed emergency care. He had waited hours before calling the hospital, time during which brain damage was occurring. Alexandra Isles, confronted by investigators and threatened with being named as a co-conspirator if she did not cooperate, admitted her affair with Claus and described conversations in which he had discussed his deteriorating marriage to Sunny. He had complained about her drinking and her pill consumption. He had mentioned divorce but worried about losing access to her fortune. The motive was clear to investigators. Sunny's fortune, estimated at $75 to $100 million, would pass to Claus if she died. He had also established a trust arrangement that provided him with significant annual income from her wealth, over $100,000 per year. If Sunny divorced him, he would lose access to that fortune entirely. If she died, he would inherit enough to maintain his lifestyle indefinitely while pursuing his relationship with Alexandra Isles without financial constraint. On July 6, 1981, a grand jury in Newport County indicted Claus von Bülow on 2 counts of assault with intent to murder. The indictment alleged that he had attempted to kill his wife on 2 separate occasions, December 1979 and December 1980, by injecting her with insulin, producing the comas that had resulted in her current condition. Each count carried a potential sentence of up to 30 years in prison. He was charged with attempting to murder his wife twice. She remained in a coma in a New York hospital, neither alive in any meaningful sense nor dead in legal terms. The trial that followed would divide not only the von Bülow family, but public opinion across America, creating a media spectacle that transformed a criminal case into entertainment. Chapter 11. Conviction, Reversal, Acquittal. The trial began on February 2nd, 1982, in Newport Superior Court. Judge Thomas Needham presided over proceedings that would last 6 weeks and attract national media attention. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Stephen Familietti, built its case on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the alleged injections. No one had seen Claus von Bülow administer insulin to his wife. No one had found him holding a syringe. But the circumstantial evidence formed a compelling pattern that prosecutors believed would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution presented the hypodermic needle found in Claus's black bag. Testing had confirmed insulin residue. Sunny's medical records showed dangerously low blood sugar during both comas, levels that physicians testified could only have resulted from external insulin administration. Medical experts explained that insulin injections could produce exactly the symptoms Sunny had experienced: the slurred speech, the disorientation, the eventual loss of consciousness. Maria Schrallhammer described Claus's behavior during the second coma in detail, testifying about his delay in calling for help, his apparent lack of concern, his strange calmness while his wife lay dying. Alexandra Isles testified about the affair, describing conversations in which Claus had expressed frustration with his marriage and his financial dependence on Sunny's fortune. The defense, led by Harold Price Farringer, argued that the evidence proved nothing. They suggested that Sunny had injected herself, either accidentally or intentionally. They presented evidence of her heavy drinking and her consumption of multiple prescription medications. They argued that the insulin needle could have been Sunny's own. She was diabetic and kept insulin in the house for her own use. They suggested that the prosecutors were building a case on speculation rather than proof. The trial lasted 6 weeks, dominating local and national news. Reporters filled the courtroom. Television cameras waited outside. The case had everything that media coverage required: wealth, aristocracy, a beautiful victim, a suspicious foreign husband, sex, drugs, and the suggestion of cold-blooded murder for money. On March 16, 1982, the jury began deliberations. They spent 6 days examining the evidence, reviewing testimony, debating the strength of the circumstantial case. It was a Rhode Island record for jury deliberation time. On March 22nd, they returned their verdict: guilty on both counts. Judge Needham sentenced Claus von Bülow on May 7, 1982. 10 years on the first count of assault with intent to murder. 20 years on the second count. The sentences would run consecutively, making the total 30 years in prison. Claus was 55 years old. If he served the full sentence, he would be 85 when released. His daughter Cosima, who had stood by him throughout the trial, wept in the courtroom. But Claus von Bülow hired Alan Dershowitz, a professor at Harvard Law School who had built a reputation for handling complex appeals and overturning convictions that other lawyers considered hopeless. Dershowitz examined the trial record carefully and identified several issues that might warrant reversal. The most significant concerned how the black bag evidence had been obtained. The search that discovered the hypodermic needle had been conducted by private investigators hired by the von Auersperg children, not by police with proper warrants, but when prosecutors tested the contents of the bag, they had done so without obtaining a proper search warrant. Dershowitz argued that this violated Claus's Fourth Amendment constitutional rights against unreasonable search and seizure. The evidence should have been suppressed. Dershowitz also discovered evidence that had not been presented at trial. Sunny von Bülow had a documented history of substance abuse that went far beyond what the defense had introduced. She consumed alcohol heavily. Multiple sources confirmed she drank throughout the day. She took prescription medications in combinations that physicians later described as dangerous and potentially lethal. She engaged in food binges that were potentially fatal for someone with reactive hypoglycemia. Witnesses described her eating entire cakes or boxes of chocolates. Medical experts reviewed her history and concluded that a self-induced coma was possible, perhaps even likely given her pattern of behavior. The prosecution had downplayed this evidence. The jury had never heard the full extent of Sunny's self-destructive habits. Most damaging to the prosecution's case, Dershowitz found notes written by Richard Koo during the original investigation. These notes, which had not been shared with the defense as required by law, revealed significant inconsistencies in Maria Schrahlhammer's various statements to investigators. Her testimony at trial had been powerful and damaging, but the contemporaneous notes suggested her memory was far less reliable than she had claimed under oath. She had changed her story multiple times. She had been coached by the investigators. The prosecution had withheld this exculpatory evidence. On April 27, 1984, the Rhode Island Supreme Court reversed Claus von Bülow's conviction in a decision that excoriated the prosecution's handling of evidence. The court ruled that the black bag evidence should have been suppressed because it violated constitutional protections. The court also criticized the prosecution for failing to disclose the notes that contradicted Maria Schrahlhammer's testimony. Claus was granted a new trial. He was released on bail pending that trial, free for the first time in 2 years. The second trial began in Providence rather than Newport. The venue change was designed to find jurors who had not been exposed to the massive publicity surrounding the first trial. Claus's legal team, now led by Thomas Puccio, a former federal prosecutor, had learned from the first trial. They challenged the medical testimony more aggressively. They brought in their own experts who testified that reactive hypoglycemia combined with alcohol, prescription medications, and food binges could produce the symptoms that prosecutors attributed to insulin injections. They presented Sunny's history of substance abuse in extensive detail, painting a picture of a woman who was slowly destroying herself through her own choices. They argued that no definitive proof existed that Sunny had been injected with insulin by anyone. The residue on the needle could have come from Sunny's own insulin supply that she kept in the house for her diabetes. The prosecution had never proven that Claus had administered the injections. On June 10, 1985, after months of testimony, the jury returned its verdict after deliberating for 3 days. Not guilty on all charges. Cheers erupted in the courtroom from Claus's supporters. Claus von Bülow, who had maintained his composure throughout the trial, embraced his daughter Cosima. He was acquitted. He was free. Dershowitz's handling of the appeal and retrial established his national reputation as one of America's most effective defense attorneys. The case was the first major trial to receive extensive television coverage during the appellate process. Legal scholars would later describe it as a prelude to the O.J. Simpson case, demonstrating how media attention could transform a criminal trial into cultural spectacle, how wealth could purchase the best legal representation, and how juries could reach different conclusions when presented with the same basic facts. The acquittal settled the legal question. Claus von Bülow had been found not guilty by a jury of his peers. Under American law, he could not be tried again for the same crimes. But the acquittal resolved nothing else. Ayla and Alexander von Auersperg still believed their stepfather had attempted to murder their mother. Sunny still lay in a coma. The family was irreparably fractured. The settlement that followed would determine both the family's future and the mansion's fate. Chapter 12. The 28 Years. 1 month after the acquittal, Sunny's children filed a $56 million civil lawsuit against Claus von Bülow in New York. Criminal court had found him not guilty under the reasonable doubt standard, but civil court operated under different standards of proof. In civil proceedings, plaintiffs needed to prove their case only by a preponderance of the evidence, more than 50% probability rather than beyond reasonable doubt. Alla and Alexander believed their stepfather had attempted to murder their mother, and they intended to pursue every legal avenue available to them, regardless of what the criminal jury had decided. The lawsuit created pressure that the criminal trial had not. Claus faced the prospect of lengthy civil proceedings that could drag on for years. Depositions would require him to testify under oath about every aspect of his marriage, his relationship with Alexandra Isles, his financial arrangements with Sunny, and his actions on the nights when she fell into comas. The evidence that had been suppressed in the criminal trial might be admissible in civil court. His attorneys advised settlement. The financial cost of litigation would be enormous, and there was no guarantee he would prevail. On December 24, 1987, Christmas Eve, exactly 7 years after Sunny's second coma, an agreement was reached after months of negotiation. Under the settlement terms, Claus von Bülow agreed to divorce Sunny, who remained legally his wife despite her condition. He would relinquish all claims to her fortune. Estimated at between $25 and $40 million, He would give up the $120,000 per year he received from a trust she had established for him years earlier. He would leave the United States permanently, never returning except for brief visits. Most significantly, he agreed never to speak publicly about the case or profit from it in any way. No books, no interviews, no movies. No compensation of any kind related to the events that had destroyed his marriage and made him internationally notorious. In exchange for these concessions, the von Auersperg children agreed to drop the civil lawsuit. They also agreed to restore Cosima von Bülow to her grandmother's will. Annie Laurie Aitken, Sunny's mother, had disinherited Cosima because the young woman had sided with her father during the trials, testifying on his behalf and maintaining her belief in his innocence. The settlement restored Cosima to equal standing with her half-siblings Alla and Alexander, ensuring she would receive her one-third share of the Aitken estate when her grandmother died. That share was worth approximately $30 million. In August 1988, Clarendon Court was sold. A committee managing Sunny's affairs, since she could not make decisions for herself, negotiated the sale to Glenn C. Randall, a Washington art dealer, and his wife Patricia. The purchase price was $4.2 million, around $9 million when adjusted for inflation. It was far less than the von Bülows had spent on the property and its renovations, but the real estate market in Newport had collapsed during the publicity surrounding the trials. No one wanted to live in a mansion associated with attempted murder. The von Bülows' tenure at Clarendon Court had lasted 18 years. It ended with Sunny in a coma and Claus in exile. The mansion's most glamorous era transformed into its most notorious chapter. Sunny remained at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York under constant medical care. A guard was stationed at her door 24 hours a day, protecting her from reporters and the morbidly curious who occasionally attempted to see the famous coma patient. She required constant medical attention. The persistent vegetative state meant she had no consciousness, no awareness, no ability to respond to stimuli of any kind. Her body continued to function with artificial support, feeding tubes, catheters, medications to prevent infections and bed sores. Her brain had ceased to produce anything recognizable as human experience. The woman who had decorated Clarendon Court with such exquisite taste no longer existed in any meaningful sense. She remained in that condition for 27 years and 11 months. Medical technology kept her body alive while her mind was gone. On December 6, 2008, Sunny von Bülow finally died at Mary Manning Walsh Nursing Home in New York City, where she had been transferred years earlier for long-term care. She was 76 years old. Her memorial service was held on January 14, 2009, at Brick Presbyterian Church in New York, the same church where she had married Claus von Bülow 42 years earlier in a ceremony that had seemed to promise happiness. She was buried at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, near her mother Annie Laurie, who had died in 1998 at the age of 98, having outlived her daughter by a decade. Claus von Bülow moved to London after the settlement, establishing residence in a flat in Belgravia. He lived quietly, scrupulously avoiding publicity as the settlement required. He maintained contact with Cosima, who had stood by him throughout the trials and aftermath, remaining convinced of his innocence despite the doubts of her half-siblings. When journalists approached him for interviews, offering substantial sums of money to tell his story, he declined, citing the settlement agreement that forbade him from profiting in any way from discussing the case. "If I give an interview," he told the Associated Press in 2012, "it will be a $5 million interview," meaning he would have to pay the von Auersperg children that amount for violating the agreement. He lived on whatever resources he had accumulated before the settlement, maintained by a pension from the J. Paul Getty estate and possibly by support from Cosima. He died in London on May 25, 2019. At the age of 92, Cosima arranged a private funeral. No public memorial service was held. Clarendon Court continued its progression through owners after the von Bülows departed. Glenn and Patricia Randall, the Washington art dealers who purchased the property, converted the service wing back into an art gallery, as Maisie Hayward had done decades earlier. They filled the mansion with their collection of American and European art and lived there during summer months. They maintained the property carefully, respecting its architectural significance. Patricia Randall died from cervical cancer in May 2010. Glenn Randall, grieving and unwilling to maintain the mansion alone, listed the property in October 2010 for $17.8 million. The price was later reduced to $15.8 million as the mansion sat unsold. In July 2012, Clarendon Court finally sold for $13,126,000 to a trust representing Paul Royf, a Boston businessman with interests in real estate development. Royf held the property for 9 years, using it as a summer residence and occasionally renting it for weddings and events. In September 2021, the sale price reached $30 million, the highest amount ever paid for a residential property in Rhode Island. The buyer was Mark Walter, Chief Executive Officer of Guggenheim Partners, one of the world's largest financial services firms and chairman of the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team. The purchase made national news, though Walter declined all interview requests. The mansion remains a private residence under Walter's ownership, closed to the public and protected by security systems and staff who ensure privacy. The building that had witnessed Sunny's happiest years and her last conscious moments had outlived everyone connected to that Christmas morning in 1980. Edward Knight was long dead. Maisie Hayward had passed away decades earlier. Sunny was gone. Claus was gone. Only the mansion remained, weathering Atlantic storms and passing winters with the indifference that stone and mortar bring to human tragedy. Which brings us to what remains. Clarendon Court stands today as a private residence on Bellevue Avenue, its gates closed, its interior hidden from public view. It cannot be toured or visited. Mark Walter maintains the property as previous owners have, preserving the facades and interiors that have survived more than a century with remarkable fidelity. The mansion is visible from Bellevue Avenue, where pedestrians can glimpse the gilded iron gates and the high stone walls that enclose the property. From the cliffwalk that runs along Newport's coastline, visitors can see the ocean facade and portions of the grounds that the von Bülows reconfigured in the 1970s. The 17-foot bluff is gone, replaced by manicured lawns that descend gently toward the sea. The elegant allée still provides a formal pathway from the mansion to the water. The gilded iron gates that appeared briefly in high society still open onto the cobblestone courtyard, though they open now only for the current owner and his guests. The urn-embellished balustrade still crowns the roof, its profile unchanged since Horace Trumbauer copied it from Colen Campbell's 18th-century engravings. The smooth sandstone, weathered by more than 120 years of salt air and Atlantic storms, still retains the classical proportions that made the mansion an architectural treasure. Clarendon Court is one of only a handful of Gilded Age estates in Newport that has remained continuously in private hands since construction. While most of the great cottages became museums operated by the Preservation Society of Newport County, or hotels or institutional buildings, this mansion has passed from owner to owner as a residence. This continuity has preserved it in ways that institutional ownership might not have. Each owner has maintained the property according to their resources and their vision of what such a house should be, but none has fundamentally altered the structure that Edward Knight commissioned in 1903. The bones of the building remain as Trumbauer designed them. The proportions remain as Campbell drew them in 1717. The pattern that emerged during the Knight era continues through every subsequent ownership. Edward Knight exhibited more talent at spending money than making it, commissioning a mansion at precisely the moment when Newport's golden age was ending and the cost of maintaining such properties was beginning to exceed even substantial fortunes. Maisie Plant Hayward went through 4 husbands, watching each one die, and saw her $50 million fortune dwindle to $4 million as she spent decades maintaining houses and collecting art. Sunny von Bülow spent 28 years in a persistent vegetative state after 2 Christmas incidents at Clarendon Court left her brain-damaged and unconscious. Each owner discovered that sustaining beauty of this magnitude required resources and commitment beyond what they had initially anticipated. Each ownership ended in ways that the owners had not foreseen when they first walked through those mahogany doors. Whether the building itself bears responsibility for these misfortunes remains a matter of interpretation and belief. Skeptics note that financial pressures plagued all Newport estates during the 20th century. that maintaining Gilded Age mansions proved impossible for most families, regardless of which specific property they owned, that the von Bülow tragedy could have occurred in any wealthy household where marriage had deteriorated and fortune created motive for murder. The tragedies, they argue, reflect the challenges of great wealth and the period in which these mansions were built, rather than anything specific to Clarendon Court itself. People inclined toward pattern recognition, however, observe that Clarendon Court has witnessed an unusual concentration of tragedy across its various ownerships. Each tenure has ended in death or financial difficulty or both. The mansion seems to demand more from its owners than its architectural peers on Bellevue Avenue, where some estates have passed through generations of the same family without the catastrophes that have marked Clarendon Court's history. They note that Edward Knight commissioned a house from a design that had never been realized, that Colen Campbell had drawn for a patron who never built it, that the mansion is fundamentally a phantom brought to life in the wrong century and the wrong country. They suggest that buildings can carry histories that affect those who inhabit them, that architecture is never neutral, that a house built from abandoned plans might carry the abandonment forward through time. Both perspectives contain truth. Clarendon Court is simultaneously an architectural masterpiece and a cautionary tale. It represents the finest expression of Georgian revival architecture in America, a perfect translation of an 18th century English design executed with exceptional materials and preserved with remarkable care across more than a century. It is also the site where Sunny von Bülow was found unconscious on a bathroom floor, beginning a legal saga that captivated the nation, produced an Academy Award-winning film, and transformed the mansion from an architectural treasure into a setting for one of the 20th century's most sensational criminal cases. The dual legacy persists. Architectural historians celebrate the mansion as Horace Trumbauer's most successful residential work and as the only realized version of Colen Campbell's Hedworth House design. They study its proportions, photograph its facades, and include it in surveys of American Georgian revival architecture. True crime enthusiasts recognize it immediately as the von Bülow mansion, the setting for attempted murder, the house where an heiress fell into a coma that lasted nearly 3 decades. Both groups are correct. The structure exists in both versions simultaneously, architectural triumph and crime scene, beauty and tragedy occupying the same 21 rooms. For those interested in visiting, Clarendon Court remains strictly private under current ownership. No tours are offered to the public. No organizations conduct programs there. No access is permitted beyond what can be seen from public rights of way. The property can be viewed from Bellevue Avenue, where the gates and wall remain visible to anyone walking or driving past. The Cliff Walk, a public pathway that runs along Newport's coastline behind the great estates, provides distant views of the ocean facade and portions of the grounds that the von Bülows reconfigured. These glimpses from public spaces are all that most people will ever see of the interior that Edward Knight commissioned in 1903, that Maisie Hayward filled with art worth millions, that Sunny von Bülow decorated with exceptional taste during the brief years when she still had consciousness to appreciate beauty. The mansion that Edward Knight built from a book of drawings continues to write its own story, adding chapters with each new owner, each new generation. It stands on its cliff overlooking the Atlantic, its sandstone facade weathering slowly, its classical proportions unchanged, waiting to see who will next attempt to sustain its beauty, and whether they will succeed where others have failed.